Hi, I'm Justin Scheiner, Viticulture Specialist with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. I'm going to tell you how to grow grapes. So whether you live in Brownsville or whether you live as far north as Dalhart, grapes are one of those few fruit crops that we can grow across the entire state of Texas. And so before I jump into grapes and tell you all about how to do it in your backyard, I want to make a few comments about some other types of fruit that we can grow. And in the meantime, if you have questions, especially about grapes, feel free to post it. And when you do, please post your location, because that's going to have a huge impact on what you can grow and types of practices that you're going to utilize. And so we're here in College Station and we're looking at Satsuma. So this is a citrus. This is a relatively cold hardy citrus that in this part of the state we can grow outdoors. You're probably better off having this in a slightly protected spot, maybe on a south wall in evergreen, and it makes a nice screen and it produces some nice fruit as well. So these have already bloomed early in the spring and have set a nice little crop of fruit. These are going to ripen in the fall and through the winter time. And so Satsuma is one of those citrus that is relatively cold hardy and has really good off the tree eating qualities. As far as quality goes, it's probably similar to cuties, those tangerines that most people are familiar with in the store. So if you live further north in Texas, protection becomes increasingly important. This particular variety is called Orange Frost. It was selected for cold hardiness. It was named a Texas Superstar by Texas A&M, and it has survived in trials all the way down to 9 degrees. Now I say survived, that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't damaged. I start to get nervous about my citrus, Satsumas in particular, once we start to get around the mid-20s to the low 20s and I start to think about protection. And so that cold hardiness does increase with tree age, but nevertheless in this part of the state, you're going to want to have some protection available. Next we have kumquats. This represents another one of those cold hardy citrus that we can grow. Similarly, kumquats ripen in the fall and through the winter. This one actually still has a few fruit hanging on it. You can see right here. So you'll get fruit sporadically throughout the year. It hasn't bloomed yet this spring, but this particular type of citrus, you eat the whole fruit, seeds and all. This variety is called Miwa. There's another variety out there that's probably less popular called Nagami. It's a lot more tart. Miwa is quite sweet. So this is another one of those cold hardy citrus that you have potential to grow. As far as Satsumas go, there are a lot of varieties to choose from. We have varieties like Owari. We have varieties like Sito, which is probably my favorite as far as eating qualities go. And then the list goes on and on. Now, if you do want to grow citrus, what I will tell you is these are your best options as far as cold hardiness goes. However, a lot of people do like to buy things like lemons, limes, oranges, grapefruit. Those are far more or less cold hardy, and you're going to need to provide protection. Unless you're really located somewhere south like the Rio Grande Valley, you're probably better off putting those in pots and bringing them in once it gets cold. So what we're going to do is walk over here to our grapes and start that discussion, and I'll point out some other fruit along the way. So right here we have a row of jujubes. These are also called Chinese dates. And so this actually represents another one of those fruit that we can grow across the state. It's a super tough plant, very drought resistant. It's actually fruit anywhere from about a 1/2 inch to 2 inch carrot, and as far as quality goes would be to an apple, maybe a little drier. It doesn't have as much juice. There are some varieties that are juicier than others. The two most common jujubes that people know are Li and Lang, but in my opinion there are a lot better varieties as far as eating qualities go. This is Russian 2. We have Sihong and So, and the list goes on and on and on. Really the only downfall as far as jujubes go is that they do send up root suckers. So they'll send up shoots from the roots, which will pop up, in your lawn or around wherever you have the tree planted. For me, it's not a problem. I'll just mow them down, but that is something that does have to be managed. Okay, we've got a couple of rows of fig option. North as far as say Dallas, it becomes increasingly difficult to grow figs. You really have to be particular about the varieties, make sure you select the most cold hardy, and then you're probably going to have to provide some protection as well. Here in College Station and further south, we can grow a lot. Before you make your judgment on figs as far as quality goes. Besides the most common figs out there, brown turkey in particular, and Texas everbearing, there are figs with much better eating qualities and equivalent cold hardiness. For example, this is Celeste. It's probably going to be your most cold hardy fig with really good eating qualities. And when you pick your figs, wait until they start to shrivel a little bit. That's when they taste the best. Okay, we have another fig here called Lemon. This is Alma, which was a release from Texas A&M. It's probably one of the best eating figs. We have LSU Purple over here. There are many types I would make before we move on is that when you select your fig, let's walk over here and look at one very quickly. When you select your fig, there are two major types. There's open eye and closed eye. This is the fruit. You can see there is no opening on the end of that fruit. That's called a closed eye fig. We want that. Open eye figs, there's an opening here where water and insects can get in and rot your fruit. All right, let's move on. Okay, we have some pears here. Quick comment about pears because it does represent one of those fruits we can grow across the entire state. If you're going to grow pears, which you certainly can, there are two things to think about. One is fire blight resistance. Statewide, that's a consideration. The further east you live, the more important that becomes. This is fire blight right here on this tree. Fire blight is killing this branch. It's a bacterial disease. And so this keeps us from being able to grow those pears that you know from the store, like Bosque and Maine Anjou, etc. So what we're growing are hybrid pears. You also need to make sure that you have a pear that has a chilling requirement that somewhat matches your location. What I mean by that are a lot of fruit require some level or some amount of cold before they break dormancy and begin to grow and flower. And so you want to try to match that requirement with your particular climate. Here's a good example right here. These are Anna apples. This particular apple has a low chilling requirement. Notice that it is full of leaves and has fruit that are already a couple of inches long. So this Anna apple tree only requires about 200 chill hours, which is not much. And they get that satisfied early on. So what that means is this breaks bud and begins to bloom, in this case, in February. So long as we don't get one of those really early hard freezes, we're okay. But we want to try to match that chilling requirement with our location, and that information is available online. And I would suggest that you visit Aggie Horticulture with any questions that you have about fruit, whether it be grapes, pears, or so on, and then talk to your county extension office because they're going to have detailed information specifically to your location. Now let's keep walking to the grapes. As we pass by, this is an apple that has a much higher chilling requirement. It did not get met this year. This is called King David. Notice how the leaves are pretty sparse compared to the Anna, and it's actually still blooming as we speak. So this is a consequence. If you don't get enough chilling, the fruit tree doesn't grow evenly. Sometimes this is harmful, can actually kill the tree. Fortunately for grapes, chilling requirement is not a problem. We don't have to worry about that when we're selecting varieties. Now, 1,000 different varieties around the world. The good news for you, or bad, depending on how you look at it, is that we can't grow most of those varieties. We can't grow about 99% of those varieties without a really extreme amount of effort and work. And so what I will tell you is that variety selection is first and foremost the most important key to success. So this variety or this type of grape that we're looking at right here is called the muscadine grape. Unless you're from East Texas or the southeastern part of the US, you may not know what this grape is. That's because this is one of our native species. Okay, so we have 13 native grapes in Texas, and this is the only one that really has been improved through breeding and selection. I'll comment on this here in just a little bit for those people that are able to grow muscadines. Most people, however, are familiar with grapes like Thompson Seedless, Chardonnay, Cabernet. Odds are, if you can think of a name of a grape in your head, that is a European grape. And so what that means is that grape comes from a whole nother continent, and so that's where it evolved, and that's where all those grape varieties were selected and developed under those types of conditions. Our grapes here in Texas that are native, they're pretty much resistant, immune, bulletproof to all our native pests and diseases. However, those European grapes don't have very much, if any, resistance at all. So what does that mean for you? Well, that means it's going to be an uphill battle to try to grow those types of grapes. That means you're going to have to really manage the heck out of those things to get them to produce fruit. Commercially, that may make sense, But in your backyard, for the average person, that's far more work than they want. And so if you're interested in growing a grape like Thompson Seedless or Flame or something like that that you get at the supermarket, what I would suggest for you is a variety called Victoria Red. So Victoria Red was named a Texas superstar by Texas A&M. It was released by Texas A&M University, University of Arkansas, and French and Martha Tarkington, who live in Victoria, which is what it's named after, in 2012. And so this grape is a true table grape in all senses. Thin skin, large berries, crunchy texture, really good flavor. And to add on to that, it actually has really good disease resistance. And so if you want to grow a true table grape, to me, that's going to be your best bet. Clusters average a good pound, even higher in weight. So it's an excellent table grape. It has one flaw, that flaw being seeds. For a lot of people, they don't want seeds in their grapes, but what I'll tell you is these seeds are pretty palatable. There's typically 1 to 4 per berry. And in my opinion, if you can crunch through blackberry seeds, you should have no problem eating the seeds of Victoria Red. So that's your best bet for a table grape. Now, if you live way far west, maybe El Paso, Midland, you can start thinking about those European grapes because it's much more arid there. The more rain you get, the more disease, or the less rain or humidity you have, the less disease. For most of us, Victoria Red's going to be our best option for a true table grape. Now, these are, like I said, this is a muscadine. This is not one of those European grapes. This is one of our wild grapes. Now, don't confuse this with the Mustang grape, which is what we typically see in College Station. The muscadine grape is typically found in the woods, we'll say east of I-45, all the way up to Delaware. So that's its native range. It likes sandy soils and it likes acidic soils. So if you've had your soil tested and the pH is below 7, that would be acidic, and that probably means it's suitable for muscadines. So if you live in the eastern, we'll say third of the state, you probably have a pretty good shot at muscadines. If you have acid soil, it's probably not going to be an issue. On the flip side, if you live in the hill country with those chalky limestone soils, muscadines are probably not for you. It's going to be an uphill battle. You're going to have to amend the heck out of the soil, and it's still probably going to be a challenge. Now, why would you ever want to grow muscadines? Well, like I said, they've been improved upon. If you've ever tasted the wild muscadines, or maybe you've only tasted one muscadine, don't pass judgment, because we have active breeding programs across the U.S., mainly in the Southeast, that are developing new varieties, and they just keep getting better and better and better. Berries now have gone all the way from about a ½ inch or so for the wild, all the way up to about 1.5 inches in diameter, about the size of ping pong balls. That thick leathery skin that the wild grapes have been thinned out where it's crunchy and you can actually eat the skin. The texture has become increasingly firm. It's as sweet as any table grape out there. And recently, this is probably the most important new characteristic in muscadines, is now there's a couple of seedless varieties out there. A couple of things to point out about muscadines is, because this is a wild grape, it is dioecious, which means it's either male or female. So those wild grapevines typically are going to be male or female. This is true for all those species, and this is the #1 question I get from homeowners about grapes is, I have this grapevine, it makes these little clusters and they never turn into fruit. What's the problem? And the problem 9 times out of 10, maybe even more, is that it's a male vine and it's never going to produce fruit. So these muscadines, by variety, are either female and they still require a male or a pollinizer, or they're self-fertile. There are some self-fertile varieties out there and you only need one vine and you can have fruit. Or you could have a self-fertile vine like this next to a female vine and it serve as your pollinizer. So right here we have Darlene, which is a bronze-colored muscadine, excellent large berries. It's a female. Next to it is Triumph, which is another bronze. It's self-fertile, and that serves as our pollinizer. So if you only wanted one muscadine, make sure it's self-fertile. Okay, so we also have muscadines on the other side. Over here we have a variety called Nesbit. It's a black muscadine. It is also self-fertile. It's next to one called Sweet Mix, which is another black female muscadine, so that's our pollinizer. What I really like about Nesbit is that it ripens over about a 5-week period. So that means you get to pick fruit for over a month. So that's a great characteristic of it. So those are muscadines. Now let's take a little walk up here, and we're gonna look at a newer vineyard project, and we're gonna talk about how to get started with grapes. All right, so we're passing by a row here, I'll point out, of Asian persimmons or Japanese persimmons. These are not at all like the wild persimmons that you find in Texas. The fruit is much larger, we'll say 2 to 3.5 inches. There are two main types. There's astringent, which if you eat them before they're ripe, they make your mouth dry out like our wild persimmons. And then there's non-astringent. You can eat them while they're still crunchy and they're gonna be nice and sweet and not have that drying sensation. There's many varieties of persimmons out there. The most common is going to be Fuyu. It's usually seedless and it's non-astringent. It's a really nice variety. In my opinion, there are some better ones out there, but you know, you could do your own exploring there with that. We've got some peaches here. You can go ahead and get a shot of those peaches. These are getting some size on them. Peaches represent one of those more challenging backyard crops as far as pests and diseases. The one comment I'll have here is chilling, of course, we talked about that earlier, but drainage. Peaches require excellent drainage. And when Hurricane Harvey hit in 2017, we have our peach trees located here in the highest part of our property with the best drainage, and we still almost lost them. They got defoliated from that extended time in the water. So how do you determine if your site has good drainage? Well, you dig a hole. Take a pair of post hole diggers, dig you a hole. If you can go down 3 feet, that's great. You go down as far as you can, you fill it with water. That hole, if it's drained in 12 hours, you're in really good shape. You really want it to be drained in 24 hours, and if it's not drained in 48, then you got to think about amending the soil. And in this case, maybe you can or cannot see looking down the rows, but we have them bermed up. So we've raised those rows just like you would a garden row, and that will help facilitate drainage. No fruit, grapes included, like to have wet feet. So in other words, they're not going to grow in standing water. So whether you want to grow persimmons, peaches, grapes, nothing likes standing water. Peaches are particularly sensitive. Okay, we're passing through here. I'll make a couple of comments. We have pomegranates right here, a row of pomegranates. They're very easy to grow. You start to get in the northern part of the state, you run into some issues with cold injury. There are some more cold hardy types of pomegranates, things like Salavatsky, Surinar, Sumbar. A couple of mentions about pomegranates is one, they're tremendously ornamental if you just want to grow it as an ornamental plant in your landscape and get some fruit. As a bonus, you can certainly do that. And then two, there are soft-seeded varieties. So the part of the fruit you're eating, the aril, is a seed and it's surrounded by some flesh with juice. Something like Sumbar has soft seeds that are easy to eat, whereas some of the others have hard seeds. So if you don't like the hard seeds, there are soft-seeded varieties out there. We have some blackberries here. I should probably comment just quickly on this. Blackberries represent one of those crops we can grow across the state. Chilling, of course, we have to concern ourselves a little bit with chilling. So you can pick varieties that have thorns or are thornless. Notice this cane of the blackberry has no thorns. This is Primark Freedom. We actually have some fruit here. We've picked a handful already. Primark Freedom represents probably the earliest ripening blackberry. Actually one of my favorites. We can keep walking here. This is a variety called Washita. Notice that it's still in bloom and it hasn't set fruit yet, whereas we have some ripe grapes already on the Primark Freedom. So whether you're growing grapes or any other fruit, you can think about the harvest season when you select your varieties. So we can select grapes that can be harvested over a 4-month period here in Texas. And that's true for a lot of those other fruit. So you have to think about whether they're adapted to your location, but also when are you going to pick them? Okay, so right here, we're looking at grapes that are referred to as bunch grapes. Okay, so these aren't the muscadine grapes anymore that we talked about. So we've talked about two types. We've talked about those European grapes, the Thompson seedless, the Flames, the Chardonnays. We talked about the muscadines. And then I mentioned the fact that we have all these native grapes here in Texas. Well, this represents a cross between one of those European grapes with those fabulous qualities and one of our wild grapes with the durability and resistance to diseases and pests. And so this particular grape is called Lamont Oak, and it's one of the best grapes that we can grow in our backyard as far as disease resistance. And so by being a cross, of the European grapes, we got some of those really good fruit quality characteristics. And across with those wild grapes, we also got some of those disease resistant characteristics. And so it's kind of the best of both worlds. And so this particular grape, you can see it has already bloomed and set fruit. So this is the cluster of berries. We'll pick this Lamont Oak probably about June. Notice we have it growing on a single stake here. The original intention of this Lamont Oak was to plant it on an arbor and train it up the arbor. Now we've changed directions here, so we're just going to keep it on this stake. And you can grow grapes this way. This is a pretty simple way to do it, just simply on a stake. Most people will provide a little more structure than this. Grapes have to have some kind of structure because they're a vine. This is typically one of those times where I get an email or a phone call and somebody says, I have this grape, it's making fruit, but it's kind of growing out of control. What do I do with it? And so they're worried about damaging their grapes. What's nice about grapes, you can see all these different shoots growing, is they're pretty tough. And you can actually just pick out parts of the grape you don't want and start ripping it off or cutting it off. And you can train it to grow basically in any direction that you want. So if you grow grapes, you don't have to worry about cutting on them too much. Let's look at one other variety here that I would recommend for much of Texas. This is called Champanelle. Notice how much smaller this vine is. They're the same age, but notice how the shoots are only 10 inches long or so. And let's look at this cluster right here. This looks like a cluster of grapes, but this is actually the flower cluster. So this grape hasn't bloomed. So those little caps will fall off and expose a flower. And the flowers aren't very attractive. They're just little green flowers. Grapes are wind pollinated. You'll see occasional insects, but then that will turn into our fruit. Okay, so this grape is a good 3 weeks behind in development from Lamont Oak, and we'll actually harvest these a good 6 weeks probably apart. So these are two varieties that I would recommend for juice or jelly. So these probably represent the best jelly grapes. Champanelle is very much like Concord in flavor, and it's a lot more adapted. So you can find Concord for sale all over the place in Texas and elsewhere across the US, but that doesn't necessarily mean it grows well here. Concord is one of those grapes that it'll grow, you'll get a vine, you may get some grapes, but at some point you're probably going to get disease and you're probably going to have major problems. Let's look at how to get started with the vineyard. All right, so I'll just point out while we pass by, we have some plums here as well. Plums have very similar requirements as peaches, so they are another one of those fruit that do require more inputs and more effort. Apples for sure. So apples are a challenge for us here in Texas, pests and disease problems, etc. So they're not necessarily the easiest type of fruit. Okay, so we're here in more of a traditional type vineyard. So we saw that you could grow grapes earlier. We saw those two vines together. They were simply propped up with T-posts with a single wire between them. We had grapes back here on a post. So you can imagine training them on a single stake, taking that up over, tying those shoots onto a trellis or an arbor that way, or you could have a small vineyard in your backyard like this. This is very easy to do, and actually it's fairly inexpensive. In the background here, we have our pest control. This is important for any fruit crop. He's actually pretty good at it, so just know that you're gonna have to protect your fruit from birds and other critters. So what we've done here is we've put in a trellis. The trellis is the posts and the wires, right? So that's what all grapes are gonna need, some kind of support. And so the way a grapevine grows is that it has tendrils. And so these tendrils will wrap around whatever they touch. They're not like some other plants that climb, like morning glories, that actually spiral around. These actually have tendrils that need to attach. And so you can facilitate that by tying grapes up. All right, so for our trellis here, what we have is 2 3/8" drill stem pipe. So we had this left over from fence building. This is pretty good material. It doesn't require any special equipment. There's no welding involved here. And it's relatively inexpensive. So compared to treated lumber, treated round posts, it's pretty comparable in price. I think this is a little more attractive. It's probably a little more durable long term. And so what we did here is we cut about 8 inches of pipe sunk it in the ground a couple feet, added a bag of concrete. Now, if you like to have your wires really tight, like a guitar string, your pipe. So like I said, we have 2 3/8 inch here, so if we really wrench down on it, they're gonna flex a little bit. You can see this post right here starting to flex. High tensile wire, so it's very strong, and so this is what's used commercially. You don't necessarily have to use this in your backyard, but it's very widely available. You can get it locally, typically at retail shops, and that's going to be a really good choice for wire. There's a lot of different ways to attach the wire. I would say try to keep it as simple as possible. This is the simplest trellis out there. So this is what we call a high wire cordon, but basically what it is you have a post, and then you have a wide height that is good for you as far as your height for picking the grapes. This one is suspended about 5.5 feet off of the ground. We also have another wire right here to support the grapevines. And so what you're gonna do is you're gonna decide what variety that you're gonna wanna plant. We said those European grapes are the hardest ones to grow. Muscadines are something you can probably consider. If you're in this area and you have some sandy soil, or you know your pH is below 7, you can probably grow muscadines. Otherwise, we're looking at those grapes like Victoria Red, the Champanelle, the Lamont Oak. You get your grapes and you're gonna get them in 2 different ways. One would be a dormant bare vine, was grown for a year, pulled out of the ground. You can see it's called, and it's dormant, just like wintertime, okay? This is a potted vine, of course, and so you can go either way. If I'm planting this dormant bare root vine, I would much rather plant it in late winter, much later than right now, okay? Because we have to start worrying about the heat and the drought that's coming. So you can go this route, or you can go this route. So what you're gonna do if you buy a bare root vine, when you get ready to plant it, you're gonna soak it in a bucket of water outside, say 10, 12 hours. You could even do it overnight before you go plant. Grow it really at just about any time of the year, but I would still rather get this in the ground in the winter time or early spring. And when you buy your vine and it arrives, and this is true for those other fruit trees as well, is we'll often see fruit on there. We don't want that fruit on there, okay? Because this little vine is not big enough to support the fruit. That's gonna be true for your peach trees or whatever else you buy. It's hard, but go ahead and cut all that off. That's gonna be the first thing that you're gonna do, is get rid of all that fruit on there, because it is gonna steal energy away from the vine itself. And so it's not uncommon for new grapevines, whether they're dormant or potted, to have fruit. Drop the fruit in the first year. Take your vine out of the pot, and in this case you can see the root system is circling around the pot. We don't like this. We don't like this because the roots will tend to keep growing in that direction. So what we'll typically do is we'll take a knife or something and we'll actually cut up around. If we can't untangle them, we'll go ahead and make some cuts vertically like this to go ahead and cut those roots. Even though we're cutting those roots, they're gonna regrow, and they're gonna have a tendency to regrow out into the soil. We want them to explore as much soil as possible. Once you plant this grapevine, you can see in this case that it has multiple shoots. We're gonna strip those off. We don't want all those leaves on there. Okay, why don't we want all those leaves on this vine? Well, because the more leaves it has, the more water it's gonna use. And if you look at the root system right now, it's contained in a very small area. So we're gonna thin this down to 1 or 2 shoots before we plant it. All right, and we'll look over here quickly. You're gonna plant your vine. This was planted as, it's gonna grow, and what you're gonna do is you're gonna start training it into the direction you want it to grow. You could train it to grow up on an arbor. In our case, we're gonna train it up to this top wire right here. We're gonna do that by tying it onto some sort of support. It's as simple as taking something like tie tape, which is widely available and relatively inexpensive. There's various types. This is a stretchy type of tubing. It's nice to have some flexibility so that you don't girdle or strangle the plant. You can take that tie tape and tie it loosely around the plant, and its tendrils will actually start to wrap, and it will affix and attach. And so that's how you develop a nice straight grapevine. In any other shoot growth that is unwanted that develops, you can just go ahead and cut that off. We can see that in an example right here. This is more common for grapes right here. As you can see, there's a lot of different shoots coming off. We only need 1 or 2 of those, so we're gonna go in and rip those off. Okay, so you don't have to worry about damaging your grape by removing those shoots, as long as you keep some. What we're looking at right here, this is called a grow tube or a vine shelter. It's a trunk wrap or a tree protector, or other names for them. I really like to use them because they provide protection from your new grapes, or I use them on fruit trees as well, young ones. It provides protection from varmints like rabbits from coming and eating, or maybe deer. We have deer problems from time to time. And it makes weed control a lot easier, okay? One more comment is you'll notice that we have mulch right here in the vineyard. We have mulch throughout the orchard. I'm a big fan of mulch. It can help add organic matter to the soil. Most importantly for me is I don't like to hoe weeds. Weed control is absolutely critical, whether you're growing grapes or whether you're growing fruit trees. This really helps with weed control. Apply at least 3 inches of hardwood mulch. We source this locally. This is from Power Line Clearing Operations. We actually got it from the landfill, and we bought it in bulk, and it only cost us about $2 a cubic yard, which is incredibly inexpensive. All the effort goes into spreading the mulch. And so we also have a drip line right here. So most fruit are going to benefit from irrigation here in Texas. We get 38 inches of rainfall in College Station, but it doesn't necessarily fall when we want it to or when we need it. So I like to apply drip irrigation to be able to supplement the water of our grapes. So year one, we're just trying to establish the root system of the grape. We're going to train it up onto our trellis. Year number 2, we're probably going to continue training it. We may get lucky and get a little fruit off of it. If you don't get very much growth, go ahead and cut that fruit off. And then year number 3 is when we're going to get fruit. And so we expect to be able to harvest anywhere from about 10 to up to even 50 pounds of grapes on a single grapevine. So something like a muscadine here, which is a really vigorous grape, we're going to want to space it at least 10 feet apart. We can get 50 pounds of fruit off of that. Those bunch grapes, we typically space them 6 to 8 feet apart, and we often get 20 pounds of fruit. What does that mean? Well, if you're into winemaking, you can get about a gallon of wine off of 15 pounds, or about 3 pounds per bottle. So you get 5 bottles per gallon of wine. So if you're into bunch grapes, of course, 20 pounds is a lot of fruit. So you can think about that when you're selecting grapes. You can pick grapes for different uses. You can pick grapes that ripen at different timings, okay? So we're gonna wrap it up here. Let me summarize quickly. We said grapes are one of those crops you can grow across the entire state of Texas. First and foremost, the most critical decision you're gonna make is picking the right variety. Lots of varieties to choose from, only a handful that are easy to grow in your backyard. So do your homework, check out our website, Aggie Horticulture, talk to your local county office. They're gonna be able to give you good recommendations for your area. Find out what grape is right for you, okay? Plant it at the right time and monitor it carefully and train it. Don't be afraid to remove shoots off of your grape. It's not going to injure it. And don't get greedy and try to get fruit on your first year. Be patient. That's true with all your fruit crops, and you'll have a lot of harvests in the future. That's all for now. If you have any Aggie Horticulture, contact your local county extension office. Thanks.